and hosting sessions. As a reminder, all the main program sessions are being recorded and will be available to use on the PHA YouTube channel. Before my dear colleague Bruno Albertini introduces our upcoming panel, I want to remind you of a few exciting PHA program launches and housekeeping items. Individual membership in the PHA is now open. All individuals above the age of 13 are invited to join the Alliance, which you can do through our brand new online members community on the networking platform, Hilo. Please also consider adding your voice to the São Paulo Declaration on Planetary Health Global Consultation. This declaration will be the first document of its kind from the planetary health community outlining what actions are necessary to achieve the great transition. You can learn more about membership, Hilo, and the São Paulo Declaration in the exhibit hall of the main event hall. There, you can visit the booths for Hilo and the PHA. Well, this ends my opening remarks. Now, Bruno, it's up to you.
Thank you, Ana Paula. Hello to all. I'm Bruno Albertini from the University of São Paulo. I would like to briefly introduce our moderator, Nicole de Paula, that will lead us through this conversation. Nicole is a Klaus Topfer Sustainability Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany, a founding member of Planetary Health Alliance in Brazil, and she is also the founder of Women Leaders for Planetary Health. Nicole has been connecting the policymakers and researchers to create a public understanding of key issues related to sustainability, environment, and public health. Welcome, Nicole, and please enjoy the panel.
Thank you so much, Bruno, and welcome everyone. It's great to be with you all today. Perhaps our panelists could appear and turn on your cameras, and it's always good to see you all. Today is day 5, so on this energetic Planetary Health Week. It's been a long week, but I'm sure that everybody's making new connections and getting ready to the action after this week is over. So our topic today is social movement and social change. What an honor to be with these accomplished and inspiring speakers to discuss how the civil society can and will take the lead to promote planetary health. So let me briefly introduce our wonderful speakers today. And I will start with Wanjira Mathai. She is the Vice President and Regional Director for Africa at the World Resources Institute. She formerly served as co-chair of the World Resources Institute Global Restoration Council and a senior advisor for the Global Restoration Initiative. She is the current chair of the Wangari Maathai Foundation and the former chair of the Greenbelt movement in Kenya. An inspiring leader, Wanjira has over 20 years of experience advocating for social and environment change on both local and international platforms. Wanjira currently serves on the board of the World Agroforestry Center, ICRAF, and as a leadership council member of the Clean Cooking Alliance. Wanjira is one of the few 6-second UK practitioners in Kenya and was named one of the 100 most influential African women in 2018 and 2020. It's a long CV, and I invite our participants to go to our website and read the rest, because I'm not even reading the whole CV. Welcome, Wanjira. And let me also introduce, it's my pleasure to have Pamela Carvalho with us today. She's an educator, historian, cultural manager, activist, researcher on race and gender relations and rights of the favela populations. She has received a master from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where she was awarded a scholarship for the Post-Abolition Characters Project. And she's part of the research group Intelectuais Negras. She's coordinator of the Art, Culture, Memories, and Identities Axis at the Development Networks of Maré, Redes da Maré in Portuguese. She is the founder of the Quilombo Etu, an organization that works with popular culture from the anti-racist education perspective. And she lives in Park Hill-1, a set of favelas Ademar. Welcome, Pamela. We're so happy to have you with us today. And finally, we have, last but not least, I want to put Dr. also Nicole Redvers, who is a member of the Denunukwe. I'm not pronouncing that well, but I'm sure you're going to do much better than me. It is the First Nation and has worked with various indigenous patients and communities around the globe, helping to bridge the gap between traditional and modern medical systems. She is the co-founder and chair of the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation, based in the Canadian North, with her foundation awarded $1 million in 2017 Arctic Inspiration Prize for the work with homeless people and those most at risk in Northern Canada. She is also the author of the trade paperback book titled The Science of the Sacred: Bridging Global Indigenous Medicine Systems and Modern Scientific Principles. Again, much more there in your CV, Nicole, and I really want our participants to join and read more about all your accomplishments. It's an amazing group today. And a bit of the logistics. It is very interesting. It's our final day of this very important week. And what we want to do today is like, what does it take? What is this, the importance of social movements in transforming and giving change and promoting planetary health on the ground? So we're going to hear your initial inputs, and then after that, we're going to have a conversation. I would also encourage our participants to post your questions already on the chat, so we try to respond as much as possible and have a very interactive dialogue. So I would invite Dr. Nicole Redvers to contribute first, and so welcome everyone.
Cho, thank you. Happy to be here. And thank you, Nicole, for moderating this session, as well as thank you to my fellow panelists and all of the amazing work that you're doing and many of our community are doing. And I want to just take a moment to root us back, because the talk today really, again, is centered around values. And it's important in Indigenous ways of knowing to complete that circle. And we started our journey Monday morning, first thing, afternoon for some folks, and perhaps evening for some folks as well around the world, talking about values. So this circle around, our topic areas, in my mind, really is helping to close the loop on this final day of discussion, bringing us back to those rooted fundamental pieces that help to create movements and make change around the world. The other thing I want to do is bring us back 2 years ago to the Stanford conference, which was the last planetary health conference that occurred. And I stood on a podium with two elders, Bessa Blondin, who's a Satu elder from Northern Canada, and Rassi Nishalik, who's an Inuit elder from Northern Canada. And we had talked about the importance of Indigenous presence, of diversity, of inclusion in the realms of planetary health in that moment, not feeling represented. And the reason why I mention that is because I look to my fellow panelists, I look on the previous week and I say, wow, what an amazing change we've had in 2 years. This is an example of social change. We have Indigenous people represented throughout this meeting. We have Global South representatives. We have all of our brothers and sisters from around the globe. So I want to applaud the social movement that's occurring within the planetary health space to ensuring the presence and voices of all of our relatives around and honoring different ways of knowing as we progress through the next steps to where we need to get as collective societies. So why is this important for me to state? Why do we look back before we move forward? And it brings to mind a few words and a few reflections. One thing I think of is the words of Chief Dan George, who was a chief of the Sitsle-Waututh First Nation. And he said, "Allow me to learn the ways of your book knowledge so that I may combine it with my natural knowledge and lead the way." And we as Indigenous peoples often understand that a blend of traditional knowledge with modern ways of knowing is a way that we need to move forward sustainably for the planet. Yet, unfortunately, in the spirit of scientific hegemony that's pervaded most branches of Western research, governance, policy, and inquiry, knowledge democracy has not prevailed. There's a term called epistemological pluralism. It's a big word, epistemological pluralism, but it's a term that recognizes that in any given practice context, there may be several valuable ways of knowing, and that accommodating this plurality can lead to more successful integrative study, solutions, practice. Yet we have often not seen this being prioritized on international scales. Yet we are seeing slowly, however, change happening, even as evidence here today as noted. Strong representation, strong presence of women and other feminine identifying genders throughout our main sessions and side sessions. So what brought this change? And I believe it was a deep reflection of the values, of the vision, and the purpose of what we are trying to do here as a collective community together. But I also believe it was due to diverse voices standing up for their rights and showcasing the strengths they offer to the global community in this time of great crisis and need. And this also occurred by
Did we lose her for a little moment? Let's see, I'll give you 2 seconds. Doesn't look like, so that's the fun of the live events and of this digital world. Yesterday we missed someone a little bit, so perhaps let's see if she reconnects. And I would go maybe to, if we interrupt, I'm sorry to interrupt Nicole, but perhaps we can have a conversation and with Pamela if she's ready. And Pamela will speak in Portuguese, so be ready to change your interpretation there. And Pamela, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Muito obrigada, Nicole.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, everyone watching us here. I'll try to speak slowly to facilitate translation and the understanding of everyone. My name is Pamela Carvalho. I live in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And I am a coordinator in a society organization named Development Networks for Mare. Time is short, so I'll briefly talk about the role of the network as an organized civil society institution that had a fundamental role in the pandemic in Brazil, especially in Rio de Janeiro. And I'm going to establish a parallel with the context of the health sector and the political scenario in Brazil, because I do see that we have people from many countries. And if I speak about Rio de Janeiro and Redes Maré, the Maré networks, people might not understand. So I'll touch on the scenario, the political and the social scenario, and also on the health sector regarding Brazil as a whole. So Brazil, as you might know, is a country located in South America, and it has continental dimensions. Brazil is a huge country with more than 200 million inhabitants. Our country has many differences. There is a high diversity in this country. So when we speak about social conditions, economic conditions, or nature conditions, natural resources, here in Brazil, in our capital city, well, that's Brasilia, but we have the southeastern region, and we have this delicate scenario that is the income concentration. There are other regions in the country in which we observe a high discrepancy. Brazil is a country that has a severe issue in terms of income distribution. And unfortunately, we are not an egalitarian country. We suffer from some issues as well, such as racism. Brazil was colonized, and up to this day, we suffer with the consequences of racism, colonialism, racial inequality, income and gender inequality as well. But we have very important things as well. Brazil is a country that stands out in terms of the health sector. We have the single health system, as we call it. The acronym is SUS. So we have this single health system that is a public health system, SUS, as we call it. So it covers the entire territory of Brazil. providing primary health services as well as advanced health services free of charge for the population. As I said, we have many inequalities in our country. So there are some places in which SUS, the public health system, does not have an effective network of services. But overall speaking, Brazil is a country where the population may have access to health services for free. So if a Brazilian citizen has COVID, health services will be provided for free. Vaccination is free as well. But unfortunately, Brazil is living a quite delicate political moment. So the free public health system has come to revolutionize, but it has been attacked by conservative powers. Well, this is how I wanted to explain how our country works in terms of the health sector. So there is this tug of war between the public powers that is responsible for the public health system and the population. Because they have to have their basic needs met, like education and access to food, and there are unmet needs. This is where the civil society organizations play a role, like Maré Network, for example. So there is a high inequality, as I said before, and our government, unfortunately, is not able to tackle all of the inequality issues that we face. And some of these issues are neglected. So in this sense, there are many civil society organizations that have emerged.
In Maré networks, for example, and I hope there's time to speak about the networks, you usually say that the ideal is that Maré networks and other civil society organizations were not needed. And that the interesting option was that the government, the federal government, could fight hunger, could support the population with actions against the pandemic, for the education, all of these actions that actually are taken by the networks. But what happens is that the population gets organized and creates different civil society organizations and associations such as the Maré Networks. And to close, Maré Networks is a civil society organization founded in Rio de Janeiro in a very specific context. Rio de Janeiro is a city that is internationally known with a very interesting geography and sociology. Rio de Janeiro has a number of communities, the favelas, and these are areas that were not planned by the government. Usually these were people that were displaced from other territories. They must find places to live. And if we talk about the origins, the first favela, the first community in Rio de Janeiro is in the downtown of the city. And it was created from people, from the soldiers that came back from a war here, the Canudos War. So these former soldiers, this former military did not have where to live. So they went to a hill in the center of Rio de Janeiro, and they started the first favela. These favelas are usually neglected by the public power. I am so happy here because my internet has not dropped yet, because in Brazilian favelas, internet does not work properly. We still have problem with basic sanitation, wastewater. We don't have plumbing, for example. To go to leave my house, I have to go down to an avenue called Avenida Brasil, Brazil Avenue, and there are no buses nearby, so I have to walk. We don't have even proper public transportation if we live in the favelas. So we see that we are heavily neglected. With the context of COVID-19, we saw in Brazil, the first person who died in Brazil was a lady. She was a domestic worker, maid, who was contaminated by her bosses that came back from Europe. This is a very latent issue in Brazil. It's very important to have specific policies to support the favela populations in the pandemic. We also saw data that hunger is increasing in Brazil, specifically in peripheral neighborhoods, in favelas, and unfortunately the government does not offer any kind of solution to these populations. So civil society organizations, as they took on the leadership here with the aim of reducing the impacts of COVID-19 in Brazil, especially in the more impoverished territories. In Maré Networks, we offer free COVID-19 tests because here in Brazil, we have a very violent public security policy. They come into the favelas shooting everywhere. These are the law enforcement agents. And in the end of the day, we have a number of dead people. And this has been going on in Brazil for several years. Because of that, we usually say that we are dealt with as figures only, as we were only another statistics. After the pandemic, not even figures we are, because we cannot, if we don't have access to tests, we won't even show in the statistics of COVID-19. So we pursue this objective of offering free tests in the Maré community. Another very important action has to do with education. We need that children and adolescents can access education remote platforms. And another important issue is food security. So we have been distributing basic baskets and daily meals to sometimes try to fight the hunger, which has been getting worse in Rio de Janeiro and in Maré and in Brazil. So that's what I wanted to bring to you, this context of Brazil, which is a wonderful country of continental dimensions that lives this dilemma between essential universal actions offered for free, such as the universal health system, but also, on the other hand, conservative forces that have been attacking us. And civil society organizations have been taking this lead, trying somehow to guarantee access to health, to food security and quality of life for our population, specifically for more vulnerable people. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
The real dimension, and of course the case of Brazil, we're now being very much in the media for the bad reasons. We're being perceived as a global threat, and having your report and your experience sharing this with the whole world is extremely important, because we're never going to achieve planetary health without tackling inequalities and all these issues. And I was glad that also connecting to what Nicole started saying in the beginning, of how happy she was that how much we have advanced since perhaps the field is also evolving, and this diversity, the inclusion of Global South and this social dimensions here that we are bringing, and with the pandemic, they're so evident. It's so important. I would just like to ask, Nicole, would you like to, I'm so sorry we lost you a little bit, but would you like to conclude yours before I go to you, Wanjira? And would you like to conclude?
Yeah, I apologize. I can't, in Northern Canada or no, Southern Canada, they had beavers chew through an internet line. So that was the excuse there, but I don't have that excuse here. I'm not sure what happened, but I'm on my phone. We've adapted. And I'm glad that everybody was able to pick up. Apologize about that. Yeah, maybe I will just finish off, Nicole. I was mentioning the quote from Herophilus and talking about some of the teachings that I received, basically saying that there's purpose in health, but there's also purpose in disease or a state of dysfunction. And I often think of actually cancer, for example, as a disease process, because many people are familiar with cancer. And cancer itself comes from cells in the body that deregulate themselves, literally recapitulating, evolving successfully earlier ancestral lifestyles at the cellular level. They're going back to an original state. So I asked myself, if a cancer cell is trying to go back to a primordial ancestral state, maybe it's trying to teach us something. And we have many symbolic cancers in our society currently that, if allowed to progress further, will also start to recapitulate successfully earlier ancestral lifestyles at the planetary level, a time when there were no human beings here, as we will have literally destroyed ourselves through a process of untamed cachexia, or wasting disease, as we eat away at our last remaining life-giving elements on the planet. Although Mother Earth is a living system that can transform and heal herself. And I'm reminded by the words of my sister Anne Paulina, an Akiniwara traditional custodian from the Mardarara Lower Fitzroy River in Western Australia. And she states that Mother Earth would be lonely without the vibrations of the human family. So as we've seen at the start of this week, Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer took us back to a basic and fundamental reality that we are of nature. We are nature. And our Indigenous natural or first laws provide a blueprint of how to prevent this type of cancer, clearly spelled out within our oral traditions and teachings with which base our social movements. And all of these teachings are based on fundamental values that need to be respected in an honorable but also a humble way. So how we turn these laws and teachings into the basis for movement building is an important element of discussion. And as we move forward here in the discussion today, we'll be talking about just that, but also some of these other considerations, as we've already heard, on how we place values and movements from across the globe. So for now, I'll end here and look forward to the continued discussions, and happy I was able to reconnect back.
We're also very happy, Nicole, to have you back, of course, and thank you so much for bringing the basics of the we are nature, right? That's one of the things we have been repeating, but translation, this translation to action, and that's something that I really want to focus on in all the debate, the how, right? Because it's not an easy task to take this leadership and make planetary health into a movement, and we're seeing this evolving. So it's my great pleasure now to have Wanjira Mathai with us, and also listen to your experience. Wanjira, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to listen to my fellow panelists, and especially hearing the Pamela in many ways describe why civil society must lead and how civil society is leading. There's so many gaps as we try and address the planetary health. But the truth of the matter is, it is all local, and what happens locally at the level that we are hearing is really about how everybody engages. And civil society is such an important.
Am I hearing?
Like my grandmother. And I always remember the fact that she and others like her eke a living out of the land. And when you consider the fact that 70%, actually 80% of all the food consumed in non-industrialized countries is produced by small-scale farmers. 70% of those small-scale farmers are women. So consider the fact that women essentially are the ones who hold the food basket, the most vulnerable sector. Even given COVID, some of the shocks that we faced within this sector came down to addressing the food value chain. The reason I share this is that the entire food system and a lot of the economic system are very, very linked. Yesterday, I heard a wonderful expression that I want to share that said, when small farms fail, whole economies fail. But the truth of the matter is, those who hold up the communities, the societies, and address the shocks that face us are almost always civil society. Both Nicole and Pamela have mentioned just how important it is when those gaps appear that they're immediately filled. COVID is giving us very little room for error, and someone has to step in and lead. I want to share the story of the Greenbelt movement, because the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, in many ways, encapsulates this. It was an organization that was started in 1977 to address issues of environmental degradation. But how the movement itself started was quite small. A lot of people know the Greenbelt movement now because the founder, Wangari Mathai, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. But in 1977, when it started, it was really about addressing very local felt needs that communities had identified. Lack of water, lack of healthy food, and lack of fuel to cook their food. Very local issues. And unless organizing around local communities, those felt needs are invisible to most of us. And so these women went and reached out and organized themselves, and together they decided, why not plant trees? Trees will address the things we are facing, the challenges we are facing, the pain we are feeling. They didn't wait for government to come and give them food. They didn't wait for someone to come from above and give them fuel wood and help the water come back. They decided to use the local wisdom, to use their woman sense, and to begin to organize around groups that would plant trees in their landscape to restore them. This is a very important point around civil society organizing, because it is an organic process that in many ways is fueled by felt needs at a very local level. It's extremely important, especially now as we talk about planetary boundaries and as we talk about climate change, because sometimes those discussions happen at a level that is very high. And we engage in those very high level discussions. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes down to the local situation, boots on the ground, locally led adaptation. What do communities do tomorrow to ensure that they can continue to produce food? What do they do to continue to ensure that the water flows in their rivers and to ensure that when the rain comes, it doesn't wash their homes away? A lot of that is about local organizing and local leadership. And the second thing that it's about ensuring that we keep our leaders honest, that we reach out to them when we understand what it means to be governed. I said to somebody one time, told me that politics is not necessarily about running, it's about caring how you're governed. And if you care how you're governed, you will engage and you will begin to talk about the issues that face you and identify the people whose responsibility it is to address those issues. So it's a critically important role that civil society plays. And I want to stop there so that we can discuss some more. But I think that there's so much around keeping leadership honest and addressing felt needs of communities simultaneously.
Thank you so much, Wanjira. And a follow-up comment is, of course, and I know you're also passionate about the question, because as also Pamela were saying, and we would like all to retire. We would like maybe not to do this work if we could choose. And civil society, in many cases, they're also stepping up for the gaps that the governments are there and the problems that are giving to us and extra problems, right? Because of course, many of the issues that we're dealing with are very complex. But if they put, for example, corruption on top of everything, it's a very complicated dimension of civil society. So I think one question for us to understand is what is your experience? What does it take then in this concretely to starting a movement on the ground? Is this leadership dimension, right? Is it this personal skills, or what would be the first step to start a movement? And as we know, probably starts in a very small and takes so long also for people to be aware, as we were giving the example of the Greenbelt movement. So perhaps, Wanjira, if you want to react on that, is it a personality or is it the conditions? What makes a great local leader?
Well, all the above. It takes a lot of charisma, a lot of energy to organize and to get people to follow. But you also need a compelling idea, you need a compelling case that people can support. And often, as I said, when it's a local issue, the people around it understand, they are in it, they feel it. And Pamela has described it so well. When I'm in that favela, I know the issues that I'm facing here. And I know the people who understand my issues, and I will support them. And that's where civil society works towards trying to help people understand a self-realization that do not be carried away by the sideshows. These issues are your issues and you are responsible. And this is how governance works. And this is how you engage with governance. But the other thing you need is patience, a lot of patience, a lot of persistence. This work is not quick work. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of commitment, because that is your community. So you're there for the long haul. It's not in and out. And that's why civil society, especially local civil society, can be so effective. But often they are so busy working, they don't necessarily know where to look for resources. So we have to make sure that those resources reach them, that we also find them, those of us who are in positions who control these resources, that we find Pamela and
I have a little.
It's extremely important that those structures understand that the people who are doing the real work will not always be visible. And so it takes patience, it takes commitment, it takes persistence, and it definitely takes a lot of courage.
Courage and patience, right? Those are two very important ingredients. I don't know if Pamela, you also would like to respond to that one.
Sim. Eu acho que eu faço das...
Well, I agree with all of Wanjira's words. I subscribe to them. I think she brings something that is really important, which is the context. The context helps to build a leadership. In my case, for example, I live in a context of linked communities, but they are engaged with political social movements for a long time now. Eliana Sousa should be here today. She is one of the founders, leaders, one of the women that started this movement. So we have in different places, and this is really curious. Seems that in the places with less access, in the communities, in the peripheral neighborhoods, that's where the great leaders arise. And here we have a strong process. I don't know if you all that are here you have heard about Marielle Franco, Assembly women, a representative that was violently murdered 2 years ago. She came from our community. She came from our favela. So the context and the territory will contribute to that. But as Wanjira said, patience, persistence, and especially having a goal. Because otherwise it's really easy to lose yourself. So our objective is to improve the quality of life of that population, or working with gender issues or health issues or food problems. So it's important to have a very well-designed goal. So it's important to establish objectives, to think of partnerships, and all of this within a political context. And it's a risky business, especially for the leaders that are more left-wing, or at leaders that have the goal of supporting impoverished populations. They end up being attacked, sometimes are murdered. So it's important to have well-designed goals and try to find support networks.
The civil action and the civil movement. In many countries, this is a dangerous activity, and we can say in the case of Brazil. And Nicole, I don't know if you also would like to contribute to this in this tensions between the personal leadership and the talent, but also the dangers that it sometimes we face.
Absolutely. The organization cultural survival, which represents a number of indigenous peoples around the globe. Just recently, noted that in Latin America alone, there's been 56 murders, 11 disappearances, 23 violent attacks against indigenous human rights and environmental defenders. Social movement is a privilege in many countries, and I think we need to remember deeply about our responsibility in places of privilege where we can be here standing up for voices. And this is even the case in some of our so-called developed countries, where I think about the Standing Rock pipeline protests, which many people heard about around the globe, no DAPO, which is still continuing today, and the amount of land defenders that have stood up to arrest, to dogs, to water bombs, to all of these other things, simply for defending the rights of what they feel is important for their communities and the rights of Mother Earth. And the rights of people and the human rights, but also animal rights and Mother Earth rights. There's been ongoing discussions I've heard over the previous week's discussions on the rights of nature, on these elements of land rights for Indigenous people, and how we bring in these conversations is fundamental. And it's the responsibility of allies like us here, even though we might come from these communities, to be able to ensure to our best of abilities that we're standing up for the people that are putting themselves on the front line. They're out there, putting their lives at risk in many cases. And we cannot forget the amount of responsibility and courage that our land defenders are representing worldwide, being in those spaces, purposefully knowing that they're putting themselves in harm's risk to stand up for Mother Earth and for our environment. And we owe them a lot of courage, respect, but most importantly, they deserve action on our behalf in any way that's possible to help further their movements.
Very important, Nicole, because this idea of social movement is a privilege in many areas. So we definitely need to highlight that. And we also, what we see what is happening in Myanmar right now, for example, also the level of violence that I noticed that it's not in the media anymore. So as it was a few weeks ago, and then we forget. And since these issues are so local, right, we're not connected, and we could miss this perspective. So I would like to now, I have some more questions here, but I see many questions from our audience. So I will pose a few questions from our audience now. And we have one here that said, how can we have a world in which many roles will fit comfortably and sustainably? Of course, that's the million-dollar questions. What is the relationship between social movements, sustainable development goals, and decolonial projects? I don't know if anyone would like to start with this one. The decolonization of global health, there's a big debate as well that we have been observing, but how do we decolonize planetary health as well? So I don't know Wanjira, I see you.
It's funny, I read that question, and the first thing that came to my mind is, if we were not so greedy, selfish, and apathetic about things, I think we would do just fine. There's just, I remember Mahatma Gandhi, there's enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. And I think that part of the way our economic systems and the capitalistic systems have evolved is just extremely exclusive. And so there's been the growing inequality that is causing so much pain and so much harm today is just a reflection of that, in many ways, its own boundary that we have crossed. And now we are starting to see some of the devastating impacts of growing inequality, the insecurity that's growing. And we can see across the world what happens when there's so much inequality. I want to also mention the fact that in many cases that we are now, especially within the climate change discussions, talking about how we reset, because in many ways, COVID-19 is a reflection of those excesses, because we've pushed the boundaries of biodiversity to the point where we are now starting to see zoonosis, and zoonosis at the scale that we never imagined before. Who thought we would all be in our homes, locked up for 1.5 years, trying to figure out how to balance work, school, mental health, and at the same time show up and do what we need to do. A lot of that is just the function of how we have to reset. And this great reset that we have to endeavor to engage in has to be balanced, because we don't have a choice. The alternative is unacceptable. So in my mind, as we talk about a green, climate resilient growth pathway, as we reset and plow into our economies more money than we've ever seen before, $17 trillion will go into global economies to rebuild. We have to build in a way that is more inclusive. We have to invest in infrastructure that is more inclusive. It is unacceptable that some people don't have access to clean drinking water. Unacceptable that people don't have access to walkways and ways to move that does not focus on vehicular traffic. So in short, I think it's about inclusion. It's about building societies that are more sensitive, that are more equitable, and definitely having leadership that cares. If you don't have leadership that cares, then you're in trouble. So that is definitely my perspective on that.
And it's very important, because what I hear from you is there's two very important points, is that prevention is it's a better approach than what we're seeing now with this 10 trillion being thrown out of the window to just fix what was not working already. And then this issue that you bring also the mental health dimension, because it can be overwhelming to do this work, and we need to take care of ourselves as well to be ready for our communities. We do have a question here for you also, Nicole, saying that there is a deep history of social change for good being met with violence, particularly in the context of environment, indigenous gender, and racial justice. So Nicole, recently you wrote a powerful article on the role of violence in planetary health. Can we panelists speak how to navigate this great transition and deep power shifts when violence and other forms of systemic domination are dark and often hidden? I think we mentioned a little bit about that, and perhaps it's the time that to discuss this idea of racism and environmental movement, because yesterday we had a conversation how we are on many tipping points. We usually tend to focus on the environmental ones, but the social tipping points are very important to address. And I think it's part of this transformation that we are seeing with our own community to becoming more diverse. So how do you respond to these tensions? Perhaps Pamela also, in Brazil as well, this, of course, very strong problem with racism.
I think of the words of my colleague, Dr. Donald Warren, who's a Lakota family physician, and he said, to be able to get to true health equity, we need to walk through truth. To be able to get to true health equity, we need to walk through truth, which is connecting to some of the previous points around, what this idea of decolonization means to Indigenous people, but also to reconciliation movements occurring in many countries around the world, at least the conversation of, and what does that really mean? What does that mean for societies to go through a reconciliation process? And I often think about how the responsibility is for self-revolution, because decolonization is not a noun. It's not a state. It is an action. It is an ongoing action of reestablishing some of those original ways of thinking, of being, of relating as collective societies. And I think we make things too complicated sometimes. My elders always tell me that it's very simple when we're talking about race, when we're talking about ethnicity, when we're talking about gender, when we're talking about all of these things. All of they say, Nicole, share with your people, help each other, love each other as much as possible. Be respectful of elders and all of those around you. Be polite and don't argue with anyone. Don't hurt anyone with your power. These are the teachings, the basic laws and fundamental rules that define our society. So I think sometimes we need to go back to the simplicity, help each other. Simple as that. And remember those basic things that root many of us within our communities. And I think if we go back to those simple times and simple ways and simple language, we see some of these leaders. I know Gandhi was invoked, and Nelson Mandela and the Dalai Lama, and all of these people who for me, remind me when I hear of those elders, because they speak from their hearts. They speak from their deep inner core, and you can sense that when you're in people's presence, when they're speaking truth. And there's power in that, not because they are powerful people, but because they've invoked the energy of the collective. They've invoked the energy of things that matter really deep down in people, because many of us are seeking something. Many of us are seeking purpose. Many of us are confused. This is a very trying time right now that we live in within society. There was note about increasing mental health. You know, we're forced to sit with ourselves in this time because we're isolated in some senses. And that's part of the process that we're pushed to go through in many Indigenous communities, is that self-reflection, whether or not it's through fasting journeys or spiritual journeys or ceremony, is to know thyself, essentially, so that by connecting to that deep core, we're able to motivate, to help, to service, to share our community members. And then things like race become a lot less, because we are one with nature. And embodying those facets, I am always amazed when elders bring these conversations and just bring it back to those simple things, how everything else just seems to melt away, and how powerful, because you can feel the love when they're speaking. So let's not forget about those simple things as we go forward in some of these very complex issues that we have, and remember that we do have a scope of influence around us.
Exactly. Back to simplicity. Sometimes it's very much necessary. And I appreciate your words, Nicole. And Pamela, would you like to come up on this theme about racism, and especially connect to environmental movements as well?
Oh, yes, I'll briefly touch on that. Just to address this matter that is highly important here in Brazil too. We have been discussing the environmental racism, as we call it. This is when we speak about the world as a whole that is an unequal distribution. When we talk about toxic waste, when we talk about access to sewer services or to water supply, this is also a manifestation of a racism. So we have been discussing this with the African countries. So they get much more waste, toxic waste, for example, and they have less access to basic infrastructure, for example, basic sanitation infrastructure. When we look into the micro environment, Rio de Janeiro, for example, here in Brazil, that's a city that has high inequalities. And this is seen in the summertime. We have the rainfall during the summertime. There are storms and we see floodings. We see landslides in the hills. We see many people that are unsheltered. They're homeless, and that happens every single year. So basically every year between December and February here in Brazil, we have landslides, we have, pre-announced tragedies, and the victims are the Black people and the poor people. So when it happens once, we may call it accident, right? But when it reoccurs systematically, we can no longer call it accident. There must be a strategy, and there is lack of planning. And this is environmental racism. This is social inequality. That's what it is. So some people from the health sector, some biologists, and some people who work with social justice and environmental justice, they have been studying this, and they have creating movements to solve that. So these are the processes that we believe are normal. Well, it's just another landslide, but it's not. It is a result of a whole history of lack of public policies that are oriented to Black and poorer populations. And this results in what they call environmental disasters. We also see that the results are used to blame the populations themselves. We can even speak about the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, the first news that we heard, they were very racist. They had a racism bias against Oriental people, Chinese, Japanese, Oriental people, Asian culture. It is the Western telling what's happening in the Eastern culture. But this happened in Brazil. It was terrible. We had prejudice against Asian populations. And today, and recently there was this piece of news that was published about this Brazilian celebrity. And then she was saying, when my family got infected by COVID-19, it was because our maid would come home to work. And then she would spend some time with us. And then she brought COVID-19 to our home. That's what she said. So pandemic has been a way of showing the racial relations that are highly unequal, and they result from our racism culture and lack of public policies to help the poor and the Black populations.
We have been discussing for throughout the whole week, and we see how specifically in the times of the pandemic, how evident they become. And I do want to also perhaps, Wanjira, listen to your perspective on that, but I will combine with some questions here because we're receiving very interesting questions from our audience. And somebody's saying, hey, thank you so much for this inspiring, thought-provoking question. How do we maintain and continue promoting local and small-scale farming within Africa when our young people are all wanting to move to urbanized areas? And how do we make connection to the land cool again for sustainable food production and reduce hunger moments in Africa? And how do we empower the girl child without trampling on the boy child and shifting roles such that down the line, the men will be advocating for empowerment of men, boys? So I think it's also, I would combine this issue because we know that this, the theme of gender is very important. Women, they have responsibility, but usually not the authority. And I think that's a very important phrase that you said, Wanjira, also in one of your presentations. And I find it's very powerful. So, and someone is raising, so I'll let it to you to share some reflections on that topic.
Well, I really like that because a lot of people, when they hear that could be a sector of interest, we actually assume that this is about tilling the land, and a lot of young people just don't want to become farmers. They're not farmers. But what we forget is that the agriculture value chain is not only in the production of food. There are so many opportunities across the value chain of agriculture that present themselves if we as investors, we as accelerators and people who are preparing people for these sorts of businesses will invest in especially young entrepreneurs. Now, this is exactly the opportunity we have. Now, Africa is a very young continent. We have an average age of 19 years old, a lot of young people and a lot of young people entering the job market every year. The biggest opportunities currently for wealth creation are being seen in the food systems and in transforming food systems, and in particular in agriculture. Just in January this year, the Continental Free Trade Agreement came into force, the largest, creating the largest trading bloc after the World Trade Organization, and especially focused on intra-Africa trade. At the moment, intra-Africa trade sits at 15%, so very little trade goes on between African countries. The opportunity today for agricultural produce to be traded across within the African continent is massive. And so we need investments, we need policy incentives so that young people are not forced. Let's not forget, there is nothing wrong with moving from rural to urban areas. What's wrong is when you're forced to move. The forced migration is the problem. It's not that you move. So it's okay to move. Many of us move across. But when you're forced to move because of opportunity, therein lies a problem. And so there's a very big movement. There are many organizations. I know the African Union, the Economic Commission for Africa are working very hard, investing billions of dollars in creating agricultural opportunities for young people to enter the agricultural value chain. There's the actual farming, but there's post-harvest production, processing, and a lot of other opportunities in between. I really believe in the agricultural value chain and the system to produce. We are going to continue to consume food. We're going to continue to need good, healthy food. And that food is going to have to come from closer by, from where we live. And that means we're going to have to trigger much more productivity of agriculture. And that will require hands, boots on the ground, brilliant brains, digital, the opportunities for digital technology and the digitization of agriculture also presents great opportunities.
And I think it's important the policy incentives, right, for the more things, because we need to prepare for all these transformations, specifically on this digital area that you're talking about is so important. We have 6 minutes left, and I wanted to also there is a question here. What advice would you have for us on how to raise children who care for and respect the land and the rest of nature from an early age? They are the future leaders and the elders of tomorrow. How do we share values that help maintain both human and planetary health? It's, again, I think we touched on this question a little bit, but I will combine with those in saying, how do we, how can you empower people to fight for a healthcare system that they don't understand? There's a little, but I think it's a mix of how do we communicate about planetary health, and how do we start this communication perhaps at a very early age. So Nicole, perhaps you want to jump in on that one.
Absolutely. I think invoking Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer at the beginning of this week that started our session, and the language that she utilized talking about Mother Earth as a relative, how we speak about something is so powerful in how we use our language. And I can speak from personally in our house, because children are so incredibly connected when they're first born. And then we sort of teach them out of this process of connection. So being able to foster and continue that. We also live in homes that disconnect us. So I constantly ask my children, where's the sun? Where's the sun right now? You know, how's the tree doing? Every single day, bringing that connection back, despite living in a wood house. Don't forget about those things that are going on around you. When is the moon coming up? These are basic questions and they seem so simple, but it remains that connection that you are a part of something larger. You are a part of an interconnected system, and do not forget that. Not one day, do not forget that relationship. You go out the door to school, you say hi to the tree. Having that presence and relationship with makes you firm that you are not alone within this world. And I firmly believe that those simple measures, even for ourselves as adults, can go a long way. When's the last time you looked where the sun was when you were sitting in a room? Or do you know where you are in the moon cycle? All of these things are small actions that help to reconnect us to those systems. And I believe we need to do those more as a society.
Thank you, Nicole. And perhaps hour two, we have 4 minutes left. And so what brings you inspiration, and what it makes less greedy? Someone's asking here also, what would it be if you had to name one thing that would make us less greedy and maybe ready for this planetary health movement? Wanjira and then Pamela. You're on mute.
Well, that's a good question. What would make us less greedy? I think it's making sure that we create and invest in inclusion, that I'm not satisfied. Who else other than myself will be the beneficiary of the gift of my wealth, my health? I talk to children all the time and I say, what else do you care about other than yourself? I think if we cared enough about others and the well-being of others and understanding, we have an expression in Africa about Ubuntu. I am because you are. The extent to which your existence is so interconnected to mine that I cannot be if you're suffering. If we understood that, I think we would be less greedy.
That's also very beautiful. And Pamela, coming from Brazil, what would be your advice?
Vou falar bem rápido.
To go really fast because of time. I think for us to be less greedy, we should invest in education. We must change completely, a revolution in the education systems in Brazil, so we have a more global education from the beginning. We are educated here by the capitalism services that make us think on ourselves, without this perception that we live in a planet, we live in the world where we must have a more integrated vision, thinking of all. If all are well, we are going to be well. But if only we care only about ourselves, the inequalities will go deeper, as we're going to see now. Racism, social inequality, economic inequality increasing. So we must invest in quality education, especially for children and adolescents.
Our three panelists, there are still other questions, but I think I would like to, in a simple reflection here, I think it's environment, democracy, and peace are intrinsically connected. So it's so important to have this dimension, the social movement, social change, bring also peace, right? And so we are talking a lot about this power of one, how hands together can really move mountains here. And it's so inspiring to hear your personal histories and your contributions. So it takes time to shift cultures, right? But we have to start somewhere. And we will conserve only, I think, what we love, and we need to understand. And the more we know, I think the less we will fear here, as you also share with us. So I'm so thankful for the opportunity to have this conversation with you all today, for the whole week of immense knowledge that I also personally had. And I wish you a very good continuation, and that you get this energy from our panelists today and ready to start, perhaps not Saturday, I think we need a little bit of rest about our Planetary Health Week, but Monday we will start certainly to take our own actions and on the ground. Thank you so much for being with us, and I'll see you in the next panel in 10 minutes. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much.